I think. Thank you for joining us today on our first panel session. We'll be doing this for an hour, mostly focusing on cyber norms. I'm just going to get straight to it. You can read the bios and the designations of our esteemed panelists today, both on the LED screen behind us and also in the booklets that you have with us. And it's in some sense a good thing that Samir brought up the issue of films, because everybody who knows Chris Painter, or everybody who has talked to Chris Painter or talked to somebody about Chris Painter, who is the US State Department coordinator for cyber issues, also knows that in his office in the State Department, there is a wall full of photos, or rather I should say movie posters of every, or at least of the interesting movies that involved cyber. And Chris, I think the only criteria that you have for the movie to be up on your wall is that it must involve some element of cyber, software, or, you know. So I asked Chris if there is an Indian movie in his wall, in his office at the State Department. And he gave me the name of a movie that, frankly, I don't know, I certainly haven't watched. I'm not sure whether a lot of people in this hall would have either. The name of the movie is Virus Divan. I don't see a lot of recognition about that movie. It wasn't a popular movie, Chris. But on that note, because you clearly seem to know more about India than many of us, I think that perhaps the most significant achievement on norms that you and your counterpart, Santosh Jha, have been able to manage in the course of the last few months is the US-India Cyber Norms Agreement. And yesterday in the US-India Track 1.5 dialogue, you said that this is the first agreement of its kind that the United States has signed with any country in the world. Why did you sign this?
Hello? Okay. Well, thanks for that introduction. I do have about 30 movie posters in my office, and hackers or computers have to be the main characters. So the oldest one is a movie called Desk Set with Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn, where she played a librarian who was replaced by a thinking machine. That was from 1958. But I think Bollywood needs to get to work on more hacker movies, then I could have better posters. I heard the introduction in the beginning about cyberspace being a global commons, and I think that's that's an interesting concept, although because the equipment in cyberspace is owned and is in various territories around the world, it's really not a global commons, but it has common-like features. So we like to call it a global condominium, in a sense. So it has features of ownership, but features of free flow of information and free flow of goods. And that really, I think, drives our vision of cyberspace. And one of our key endeavors in this area is the idea of pursuing a stability framework in cyberspace. And for many years, we've had a dialogue now with India, and it's really gotten increasingly strengthened over the years, but particularly in the last year, it's been very, very strong, punctuated by visits between our president and your prime minister. So President Obama hosted President Modi, or Prime Minister Modi recently, and one of the things that came out of that was a series of fact sheets that talked about the importance of cyberspace more generally, but also norms in cyberspace. And you referred to something that we were able to include in that statement, but which we signed just last month when I was here for the Strategic and Commercial Dialogue, which was really the first of its kind with any country, which is a comprehensive strategic framework on cyber and internet issues with India, which includes a whole range of different principles that we agreed to, including on multi-stakeholder governance and free flow of information, but also, most importantly, on norms, and including a commitment to promote international security and stability in cyberspace through a framework that recognizes the applicability of international law to state conduct in cyberspace and the promotion of voluntary norms of state behavior in cyberspace during peacetime, and then certain confidence building measures. So, as we talk about this international stability framework we're trying to advance, India has been and is a key partner. And that's an important issue, because what we're trying to do here is, as more and more countries are developing cyber capabilities, there's a range of different issues you're trying to deal with in cyberspace. And one is to try to make sure you have stability so that so no country really feels that if they have an incentive to disturb that stability. And you do that by first saying that international law applies, just like it does in the physical world. Now, how it applies is something we're still working on. There's unique aspects of cyberspace, to be sure. But you don't need a whole new legal concept for cyberspace. The second part of that pillar is voluntary norms of state behavior, things that states should refrain from doing or things that states should cooperate in doing. And there are some key ones that we've been promoting there in terms of not attacking the critical infrastructure of another state, not attacking a CERT or using CERTs for anything other than good network defense purposes, and understanding that you should share information and try to mitigate malicious activity if it's emanating from your territory and another state as. And those are key ones that we've been promoting in the UN and something called the Group of Government Experts, which I'll talk about just in a moment. But also there's a fourth one, which we've reached an agreement with China, with India and others in the G20, that countries should not steal through cyber means the intellectual property and trade secrets of another country and use them for the commercial gain of their industries. And that was a key agreement with China, but now it's been memorialized in the G20 and in the agreement between India and the US. So as we look at advancing this framework, there are two things I just want to quickly touch on in terms of the strength of the US-India relationship. One, in this group of governmental experts, that has been the place where we've made tremendous progress as a crucible of a small number of countries, 20 this year, 25, including India, and we're very happy India is a member, to try to make progress on advancing the stability framework. One, they've agreed that international law applies. They agreed to these certain norms in cyberspace, and they agreed to the importance of confidence building measures. So there's more work to do, and we want to build on that this year. And I think India and the US can and should and will collaborate in trying to build on that consensus and make further progress. The second thing we want to do is universalize these norms. In other words, promote them around the world to get more and more countries to adopt them. The G20 was a good start, but I think India and the US can work together on that. And the third that I wanted to touch on is this idea of confidence building measures. Confidence building measures are, nothing, it's not really rocket science. It's the kinds of transparency and cooperative and stability measures where states can get better confidence, where they don't really trust each other or understand each other, and where cyberspace, where attribution and other issues are difficult, where confidence building measures, which is really the only analog to the nuclear world that I think it applies here, is very helpful. And these are practical measures. When you're talking about norms in international law, that's a little more theoretical. When you're talking about confidence building measures, that's concrete measures that you can take. And so I think there's a lot of room for India and the US to work both together, but also regionally. In the ARF, for instance, which is a regional organization here, which India and the US participate in, where we can make some real progress because one of the goals of ARF is confidence building and confidence building measures. So cyberspace confidence building measures that include things like transparency measures where you're exchanging doctrine, you're exchanging points of contact, you're exchanging how your governments are organized. That's helpful because it breaks down the mystery of how this space works. Cooperative measures, you cooperate against shared threats like a botnet attack, for instance. And then ultimately stability measures, things that states would refrain from doing, agree to refrain from doing, and if they don't do them, or if you have a transgressor, states can act cooperatively in a group to act against the transgressor. That's a little ways off, but getting acceptance of the norms, getting acceptance of international law, and then building that like-minded group is going to be very important.
And by way of information, on this panel today we have, I think, 2, 3, 4 people who represent their governments on what Chris was referring to as the intergovernmental group of experts who articulate cyber norms, because presumably they don't believe the time is ready for a treaty yet, who will articulate norms on ICT security. And the latest entrant to this, although India has been previously a member of the GGE, the latest entrant among the group of 25 that had been created this year is India. And I think what is significant is that until 2012 or 2013, perhaps Mr. Jha would correct me, the foreign ministry in India did not have a global cyber issues division. What Santosh Jha, who is the cyber coordinator of that ministry, with the help of his superiors in the foreign ministry, has done is really step up the engagement of India with the United States, but also with other countries. Santosh, I wanted to ask you, at some point, and you're probably already talking to the Russians, at some point you're probably going to talk to the Chinese. You're going to have some diversity of opinion against the various, or rather you're going to have differences in language, to put it mildly, in the agreements that you sign. The United States is going to say, oh yeah, international law applies to armed conflict in cyberspace. The Russians are going to say, yeah, sure. The Chinese are going to say no. How are you going to manage these differences?
Well, I think you need to leave that to diplomats as to how to work out different. Just to elaborate on what I'm saying, we had the occasion to do the US-India agreement, just as it is the first of its kind for the US. It was the first of any kind for India. And I think some of the things that Chris said, just to elaborate upon, if I was to go back as to what was the basis as to why we wanted this document, was that last year, when India made a very clear announcement about the multi-stakeholder model, immediately after that, we had our fourth round of the meeting, the bilateral meeting in Washington, D.C. And what the earlier announcement did was to create the right atmosphere for the conversations that we had there. And we saw that there was clearly a lot of other things on which we had always agreed, and this was perhaps the one stumbling block, which was now over. There were 30 plus action points that emerged from that. One of them was, of course, to explore the possibility of a document. The document, right from the outset, had something more than just a simple framework agreement on cooperation. It was aimed at looking at various ways in which we could agree, being the two largest democracies in the world, put out certain values and principles, including norms, in place that we could agree upon, because we had many commonalities and shared perceptions. And I think that is what is the singular achievement and the character of this new framework agreement. It was possible to cooperate with US without this paper, but what distinguishes it is this kind of articulation that it finds. And in fact, Chris would agree, I think, we decided that we should have a section of norms as well, where we say that we'll not just adhere to them, but promote them internationally. We have today had a full day of discussions where we agreed to take this further and continue our dialogue on this in order to identify new areas in which we can propagate thoughts and views on the subject, including within the UNGG. Coming to the Russian question and the Chinese one, I think, look, I mean, there are differences with in the views of each country, and there are degrees in which they differ. But it is possible to work along with the differences, and that is, if I was to give an example, we have been talking to the Russians as well. We do not have a dialogue with the Chinese as yet, which we perhaps might initiate in the coming days and months. But I was last week in Moscow. We had long discussions following our sideline discussions in the UNGG, and we are likely to come out with a document not similar to that of the US, but in terms of cooperative elements, pretty strong agreement with the Russians sometime in the near future.
Thank you. Henry, thanks for joining us. As you were the chair of the 2013 GGE, right, so you have been involved in the GGE reports in 2013, and if I'm not mistaken, was part also of the 2015 intergovernmental negotiations. No, you weren't. In the 2013 and 15 reports, which saw perhaps an exhaustive listing of possibly all kinds of cybersecurity norms between that nation states could possibly agree on. There is a concern that in this year, the 2016 GGE, has probably run out of steam even before it began. In the sense, there are really no new norms that countries can agree to. Whatever is left are bones of contention, and the minimum common denominator has already been arrived at. Do you agree with that?
No. Arun, thank you. But as a member of that group, how can I possibly agree that it's run out of steam? But I think we need to go back a bit. Remember, this process has been with us now since about 2004-05, and we have come a very long way. You referred to the 2012-2013 group. That was the group that decided that international law applies to state behaviour in cyberspace. That sounds quite banal, but it was a lot. It was very hard work getting there. But now, of course, it has become the orthodox view. There's still some differences of view as to exactly which bodies of international law apply, but I think it's now accepted that the framework and principles of international law are the starting point for the discussion. You also referred to 2015. We were not a member of that group. With India, we have now returned, and we're very glad to be part of the conversation again. But the great achievement of 2015 was, of course, the norms that you've referred to. The group made progress on the international law side, but it also articulated, identified a list of 11 voluntary non-binding norms, and that's, I think, the great achievement there. Voluntary norms that it applies in peacetime. In terms of sort of running out of steam, running out of puff, the 2016-17 process have just gotten underway, and I sense very much that the group feels the need to elaborate, to drill down in the norms that were identified in the previous process. So I don't think there's a great rush to identify even more norms, but rather there is a process of elaboration, of explication of the previously agreed norms. There is, I think, a view in the group among some of the experts that we're looking at a different type of report, or a report that elaborates rather than creates or identifies further norms. So that's, I think, where we're going. Where we go after that, that's really a matter for the General Assembly, of course. But when people think of writing these processes off, I think about, well, exactly what problem are you trying to solve? And you identify mechanisms in terms of the problems that you're seeking to resolve. I think very much, as I think has been alluded to, there is a need now for us to move beyond identification of norms to universalizing these norms, taking them out of the expert group process into the General Assembly. And the General Assembly, of course, through the process of adopting resolutions, is the way in which you turn norms into customary law and international law. So I might leave it at that. So.
Thanks, Andre. Angela, I want to bring you in at this stage to talk about the role of the private sector, because in your capacity within Microsoft, of course, you're doing, Microsoft itself is doing an enormous deal in conceiving and articulating cyber norms. And I wanted to ask you what the private sector can possibly do to influence the creation of cyber norms when it has not been a participant or not even an observer of a formal observer in that sense of intergovernmental platforms like the UNGGE. And I know that Microsoft released a fantastic report on cybersecurity norms earlier this year. And you also divide it into defensive and offensive norms. And I want to read out an offensive norm. I think it is an offensive norm, by which I mean norm for the offensive uses of cyberspace. It's not an offensive norm. States should exercise restraint in developing cyber weapons and should ensure that any which are developed are limited, precise, and not reusable. Limited, precise, and not reusable. And I want everybody in the room to sort of think what the impact of, say, a Westinghouse announcing this norm, saying that nuclear weapons should be limited, precise, and non-reusable, and whether and how governments would have received it. And yet, the norm, as I understand it, through efforts of Microsoft and other private sector, the report has been well received, probably because, unlike the case of, the analogy to nuclear weapons is not entirely accurate, and you have more stakes in this game than, say, a nuclear plant operator. But how easy or difficult has it been for, or to sell the norms that you have conceived with the help of other private sector representatives to government delegations or government representatives?
Thanks. Oh, there we go. Thanks, Arun. And before I answer your question, I'd just like to say thank you to ORF and my co-panelists and the attendees here at CyFy. It's my honor to be here in India the 8th time and 3rd time at CyFy. Before I get exactly to our role in influencing the development and implementation of norms, I think I briefly might even get to, so why is Microsoft and or the private sector even engaged in that conversation? Because I think that even comes before the conversation on what can we do within that conversation. And I think it's a couple-fold. First of all, the actions of states and non-state actors in this space have a direct implication on our customers and our products and services. And then I'll just very briefly expand on that. Because I think people tend to be like, oh, okay, Microsoft is involved in this because you're worried about people, doing something to your operating system or doing something to your digital certificates, when in fact, it's actually much broader. Our customers and ourselves are dealing with a very distorted threat environment. You have over 37 countries around the world who have stated offensive capabilities. And whether you're talking about the private sector, and I don't mean just the ICT private sector, I mean the private sector generally, our products and services are sometimes the vectors for attacks, as you would see with the recent example from shadow brokers using both US and Chinese companies' products and services. We are often the targets of the attacks, as you see with the Ukrainian power companies, with the Saudi and Rasgas operations in the Middle East, or Sony, or the reciprocal recipients of those attacks, as you saw with the distributed denial of service attacks on the US banks. And then we have to respond to it. So not only are we the targets, we're dealing with this distorted threat environment and having to do response. And ultimately that creates kind of two existential challenges. We're worried about the loss of trust in ICT products and services and how that would affect the stability of the global cyberspace, ultimately threatening the stability that has enabled these huge economic development and social benefits that Director Joshi spoke about in the very beginning. So that's a little bit of why we're even here. And so when you get to kind of how can we influence or engage in this conversation, I think there are a couple of things that we have done and I've seen other private sector companies do more recently. So first of all, on the development side, particularly relevant to offensive norms, we're not going to have a seat at the UN, nor should we have a seat at the UN. That is an intergovernmental forum. But we can do things like develop and publish the reports that we have that include things that states should be thinking about when they go into these negotiations. As Arun mentioned, we've written 3 papers on norms, the last 2 of which both included a set of activities that were discussing states' responsibilities for offensive action in cyberspace, and importantly, industry norms, how industry can actually take actions that are supportive and complementary with the state norm. And I'll give an example here because I think it makes it a little bit more practical. So there was a norm that we published in 2014 that said states should not seek to subvert or exploit the broad commercial ICT supply chain because that would have huge consequences, much greater. They would not be able to sufficiently control the targeting and reuse of those vulnerabilities. We then have a corollary norm for industry that says an industry should not enable or allow states to engage in that behavior. Another one has to do with vulnerability handling. States should have a policy for how they handle vulnerabilities with generally a preference to disclose them to the vendors, and vendors need to have a process to actively respond to vulnerabilities that are identified. So there's a complementary action. We can push out information that helps states understand the technology, the implications and consequences of that technology. The other place that I think we have a really clear role is in the implementation of norms. And I've actually heard that's one of those clear focus areas for the GGE moving forward. One of the things that is unique is there are a subset of folks in the private sector who have and can see state activity in cyberspace and could contribute to the technical attribution of those actions. And so those are some of the things that we can do to influence and support development and implementation of norms. I think your last question, Arun, was is it easy or difficult? It's not easy. You'll notice I started with why we're here, and Microsoft was engaged in this and has been engaged with this for quite a period of time. Before norms was a topic at seemingly most conferences around the globe on cybersecurity, and it hasn't been easy. But I will say that there are two things that I think have really change the trajectory of not just the conversation, but making it easier for us to engage. One is the unfortunate silver lining on the cloud that people are aware globally of cyber attacks on critical infrastructures. And that awareness has driven a demand from our customers and even from governments for us to engage. And the other side really is that there has been such meaningful progress in the GGE that there's now a wave of activity that says, how can the private sector contribute to help advancing many of those ideas? And I think those two things have really helped move us from a place where we were first saying, no, private sector needs to be involved in this discussion, to now going, GGE has even recognized that the private sector and civil society should be engaging and influencing. Now it's not about you should or shouldn't, but how and how to do so constructively.
Thanks, Angela. And lastly, David, thank you for joining us. You're France's representative to this UN intergovernmental group, and I know you want to talk about the GGE a little bit as well, but perhaps I can place it in context of something that France had to deal with in 2015. And to the uninitiated, in April 2015, the television channel TV5 Monde faced a highly sophisticated and disruptive attack, and I was going through the impact of that attack on the channel, on TV5. It completely disrupted broadcasting on all 11 of TV5's channels, completely shut down TV5's internal communications network, took control of TV5's website and social media accounts, replaced content on the website with pro-ISIS statements, posted information on social media accounts purporting to be the names and personal information of the relatives of French soldiers involved in operations against ISIS. Curiously enough, I think it was a few months after this highly disruptive attack on the channel, I think that to the extent of what is available on the record, I think French judicial authorities said it's not ISIS, it's probably Russia who did the attack. And whatever the final assessment of the French government would have been in determining who was behind the attack and how to respond to the attack, and this is, these are the two questions that I would like to, request you to field. When it is so difficult to find out whether it is a non-state actor supported by a state, whether it is a state, an adversarial state itself, or whether it is a non-state actor independent of any government involvement, say, like the ISIS, how do rules of attribution or norms of attribution that the UN GGE has been grappling with help you absorb the norms into national practice? In other words, plainly put, how are you going to respond, and how did you respond to something as sophisticated as this?
Thank you, Arun, for asking me the easiest question we face, which is, of course, attribution. My answer to what you said is, well, first of all, as a fact, the French government has decided not to name and not to attribute, and especially in this case, which was absolutely striking. Cyber caliphate, Russian hackers. I can't say more than that. We won't publicly attribute, which is a way of saying that undoubtedly attribution is extremely difficult, and that even if we can read every line of code, there is still room for manipulation. And so the whole question of attribution, it remains here on the table in front of us. We don't have a clear answer to that. And so it means that we may have to change our way of analyzing intelligence and not only rely on facts, but also rely on deductions, reasoning, and that implies a shift in the way our intelligence community works. That's possible. But it implies a lot of risk, especially if the attacked government or the government who considers himself attacked decides to launch countermeasures, because of course there will be a reaction, or there can be a reaction. So that's the first thing. Second thing, what it does imply is the work at the GG is absolutely crucial, as it has been said by Chris, Santosh, and Henry. The last two reports have been extremely good, probably against all expectations. We will try to do our best so that the next report will be as ambitious. Probably, as it has been said, we won't be able to produce any new big norm, but probably we should prioritize and stick to at least two very important things that have been mentioned also, which is first, how do we make sure the global community is aware of the GG recommendations? And this is absolutely crucial, because sometimes I feel like the world knows more about the Tallinn manual than the GG reports. So it's good, but the GG reports has produced a very important work. So how do we do that? This is still to be discussed. And second, how to make sure that those recommendations and those norms are actually implemented by the global community, or should I say the states. So that's one thing. So we've made some proposals at the last GG report, at the last GG session in New York, and we will make sure to circulate them, notably to try and see if we can be more precise and more ambitious on some norms of behavior, like proliferation. We think it's important that we try and tackle the problem. And second, and again, coming back to your question about attribution, the fact is attribution is extremely difficult, but once we may have found a solution to that, then it carries a lot of very promising stuff. And so at the GG, we believe that we have to build on attribution, but also, since it's still very difficult and that we have no certainty as in the next, the close future, we have to build without attribution. And so probably for this session, we will have to build without attribution and make sure that at least some of the norms can be in a way better implemented, and we'll see about that.
I have follow-up questions for Chris and Angela, but now that we're getting into Q&A, if you have questions, could I please ask you to proceed to the mic, and we will take questions from both sides of the aisle. And but first, Chris, I know you are dying to tell us who really hacked the Democratic National Convention's computers, and we're really dying to know as well. But before you answer that question, I would also, somebody is trying to manipulate your elections. I mean, it clearly seemed that this attack on the DNC is aimed at either sending a signal, or perhaps you have your own assessments of it. But something that we were talking at least a few years ago as a flight of fancy, using cyberspace for manipulating democratic processes, seems to be happening, and it is happening to the most powerful country in this, the most powerful country. How are you responding, to the extent that you can tell, on the diplomatic front, bilaterally, with the countries that you engage with, such as India, but also in forums like the GGE?
So I'm not going to, as our president said, this is an active investigation, so I'm not going to go into detail about that. But what I'd say is what we found really across the board, and this is why I think cyber has become so important, and why it's now really gone from a very kind of niche technical issue. When we first started having CyFy, and even well before that, there was really the technical community cared about this, and the law enforcement community, but most people didn't really understand what cyber meant and what the threats that meant they're out there. But now it's really transformed. Now it's really top of mind. There's major attention in the U.S. from our president. The Australian Prime Minister was just in the U.S. and he gave a speech about cyber. It's been featured in the Modi-Obama dialogues I talked about. We just had our French dialogue with David just a couple of weeks ago, a whole of government dialogue, just like we did with India today. It has now become, as I often say, the new black. Everyone really does care about this now, and that's good. Now they don't know what to do about it, and that's where I think all of us come in. The other thing I'd say is, in terms of the harms, just like in the physical world, you can use cyber not only to cause harm in terms of stealing information, which you're worried about, or denial of service attacks that make things unavailable, or changing the integrity of information, but you could use it for a whole host of purposes, including terrorist use, influence operations. That's hardly surprising, but we need to do all we can to protect our networks. That's part of it, the defensive part, but also make sure we have a full suite of responses, including diplomatic responses. And we, of course, are engaging with all our allies on that. I just wanted to address one thing very quickly that, in terms of attribution, but also in Angela's presentation. I think it is important to get other stakeholders involved, and I think we have been sponsoring a series of conferences at Unidir, for instance, to bring not just governments, but other private sector and civil society people in, and that's important. We did something at MIT recently. John Mallory, who's in the audience, sponsored that. It's an important part of the dialogue as we go forward, and I think that is important. What I'd like to see is more participants. It's great Microsoft has been doing all this work, but we need more industry participants. Industry is not monolithic, so there are many different kinds of industry, and the same with civil society. And then on David's point on attribution, attribution is difficult. It is not impossible. We were able to attribute the attack of North Korea on Sony Pictures. When you have a prolonged course of activity, it's easier to do attribution than when you have a single incident. You don't look just at the cyber trail. You also look at all the other evidence you have, following the money, if it's a criminal case, other sources of intelligence you might have, just like you would in any other thing. And so it's not impossible. And I think that the myth that it is totally impossible emboldens people to act in a way that's destabilizing. So we have to make sure that we have and are using the tools that we have. And part of those tools are all of us working together diplomatically to make sure that we can have an effect. And I submit that in terms of getting the agreement with China on the theft of intellectual property, that was sustained diplomatic pressure over a significant period of time at a very high level that helped achieve that.
Let's take questions. The gentleman at the mic.
Yeah.
May I request you to move to the mic? If you have a question, please introduce yourself and please keep your questions very short.
Okay, so I'm Major Chakravarti, and my questions are two simple ones. One is to Chris Painter and Santosh Jha. With the Defense Foundation agreement called the SysMoa, which whenever we buy a US defense equipment, unless you sign the SysMoa, you don't get the communications part. Now that you have signed an agreement between India and the United States, is the SysMoa part out? That foundation agreement, should we be getting, let's say, whatever, I hope you know the US is the biggest defense supplier today to India. The second question is, we are fully aware of the present elections in the United States, which you just referred. I only heard last night, both the candidates, and cyber warfare is something which the Republican Party has said that Russia must come in and use cyber warfare against the Democratic candidate. Now, I'm sure Chris Painter won't be only having 30 what you call Hollywood movies put on it. What is the and you're supposed to be the most offensive cyber warfare nation in the world. This is Xi Jinping's statements. So please tell me, what are you doing to counter what Donald Trump has requested Vladimir Putin to do in actual terms?
Well, I'm not going to, on the first question, I'll defer to Santosh on that. And the second one, I'm not going to comment on the current elections, except for to say that it is important that we both have defenses in place and that we have the tools, diplomatic, trade tools, law enforcement tools, and really the whole suite of tools, including military. I would dispute the fact that we are the most offensive or offensive capable nation in the world. We certainly have capabilities, and we've been transparent in talking about we're developing capabilities. We have doctrine that goes with those capabilities. We think other countries need to have doctrine too, and our doctrine is one of restraint. And I think we should never be in the position of backing down when we see those threats there. We're going to need to take measures to make sure those threats don't happen, whether they be criminal, whether they be nation state, or whether they be terrorists.
Well, it is not a directly relevant question, but just, digging my memory, I'd like to answer that. You look, SysMoa is not a licensing agreement. It doesn't enable technologies to be made available directly. It has indirect implications for the availability of technology. Secondly, it is a very specific type of defense technology that you're referring to. It has no relevance, or almost very little relevance, to the kind of agreement that we have done between India and the United States. So SysMoa, if you put it the way it is, it's a communication, interoperability, security memorandum of agreement. And it pertains to communication between military, aircraft, ships, etc. And it's highly encrypted and proprietary security software that is involved in that. Of course, it might have cyber implications, but it is not directly relevant to the agreement that we are talking about.
I think this seems to be the night of the generals. I'm General Chopra. I'm a platinum veteran of 4 wars, and if I look at the future, I can see the 5th war will be cyber warfare. In the opening address by Sanjay, ORF, he talked about conflict in commerce and conflict in cyber. I would like to add the phenomena of terrorism to this, which was indirectly referred to by Sharik. I don't know if he's still here. They progressively are trying to threaten, dominate, hack, and influence internet. In fact, if I look at your heading over there,
so is there a question?
Yeah, they'll be responsible for internet misgovernance. What I want to know from the panel, or Sharik if he's still here, how do we propose to tackle this threat coming from the terrorists when nation states are not unified with regard to terrorism, and there are some sponsoring it? In other words, they are indirectly responsible for cyber warfare and internet misgovernance. Thank you.
Thank you. David, I'm going to let you field that question, but because it's also sort of somewhat centrally implicates the role of non-state actors such as ISIS, not just in terms of cyber attacks, but also if this is something at all that the GG is willing or comfortable to talk about, which is online radicalization. Now, what is the threshold where radicalization ends and a cyber attack begins. So what is the strategy that you are, at least from a national perspective, articulating to deal with non-state actors?
Well, first of all, it's non-state actors are not really in the realm of the GG. Maybe one day, Angela. But for now, it is not the case. But still, it is true that...
But you do require non-state actors, states, to stop harboring non-state actors who perpetrate malicious activity.
Absolutely, you're right. And at the same time, we also stated in the DGG report also stated in the past that the state should prevent proliferation of tools, etc., which implies, of course, the industry and the private sector. So that's one thing. At the same time, it is true that now even, let's say, less developed countries have the ability for a very low cost to use tools, malicious tools from the private sector and launch attacks. Very expensive attacks in terms of consequences. So that's another thing that maybe at some point we will have to address. 3, about terrorism and its relation with the internet. So what you've described, I don't think we're there already. I mean, Mr. Zafar talked earlier about counter-narrative, and we'll talk about that tomorrow, because we are the French government, we have to be we have to be not too bad on that field. And again, it's a difficult challenge. I think what we haven't seen yet is cyber terrorism. I don't think that ISIS so far has the ability to launch cyber attacks that could have real tremendous consequences in real life. For now. Let's cross fingers.
Thanks. There was a question.
But by the way, I would like to put a question to Chris. If you have any clue about the Yahoo hacking, I'm interested, because as a user, I guess my personal data are currently being sold somewhere on the dark web. So if you have any clue, I'm interested.
Too.
Hello, I'm Harsh Gupta, and I've been intern at CIS. So I want to know, so often the norms of the internet, or what things are possible and what are not possible, are often governed by the technical layer. So say if attribution is inbuilt in HTTPS or HTTP or the technical standards, then it can be very good for the government and all. So I want to know, is there been interaction from the government side to the technical standard bodies like IETF and W3C, and what are their participation in it?
I mean, there's pretty frequent interaction with the IETF and the various standard setting bodies. And there has been for years, and it's because governments and industry and others are involved in standard setting. What I think you're positing, though, is trying to address the attribution problem and say, should you do some standard to make attribution easier? That I'd say is problematic, because we're not trying to make attribution perfect on the internet by changing the standards, because if you do that, then it really affects privacy, it affects freedom of expression, it affects people expressing dissent online, and really human rights online. So you have to, there are other ways to do attribution. And I should say that we attributed the attack from North Korea. We haven't attributed other attacks, but that doesn't mean that we don't know who did it. We'll decide if it's appropriate for us and if it serves our purpose to make that attribution. And we will, as our president said, use tools that may be visible and some that may not be visible. But I think working with standard setting bodies to change the fundamental character of the internet would be problematic. Working with standard setting bodies to make the internet more secure, that's something we're doing.
Is there any effort by Indian government or other governments?
Just to add to what Chris is saying, it was a very, very good question, I think. Congratulations. I think that is an essential dilemma, and privacy is a right, it's some very reasonable one at that, but it requires some thinking as to whether the solution that you are talking about could be a way forward.
Yeah, my question is to Mr. Chris. The way we have our exercise with the Navy, Army, Air Force, with US and India and rest of the world, do we have such exercise in cyber security or preparation? And what is your funding and budget allocation for this type of?
I don't know what funding is, but I'd say yes. There are a number of things I think really do help in the area of cybersecurity. I think Angela and others will agree with me. One is to do national level exercises with the private sector, with the government. Sometimes they can be tabletop, sometimes they can be full-out exercises. We've done that in the U.S. for quite some time. Also, our military, and this is hardly surprising, I think militaries around the world are including cyber as part of exercises because cyber is part of what they do every day. It's how they communicate with each other. It's how various systems work. So increasingly, cyber and cyber attacks and making cyber unavailable and how you deal with those issues are part of military exercises really around the world. I don't know the specifics of exercises that are going on now between the US and India, but I think that's something that's becoming more and more part of all exercises. So both civilian exercises where you're exercising how you're organized, how you respond to incidents, how you work with the private sector, but also those military exercises are happening, and I think they're important.
Angela, I want to bring you here, bring you in on this conversation because I think one is seeing a general tendency where the role of the private sector in the creation, in the conception of cyber weapons is perhaps being institutionalized. So for instance, you have initiatives like, I think it's called the Defense Innovation Unit X, the DIUX, which is a formal collaboration between the Department of Defense and Silicon Valley. And I know you've probably got tired hearing of Stuxnet, but you have to balance, you have a very fine line to walk here from saying that the integrity of your products is important and governments cannot use these products to launch malicious cyber attacks and thereby implicate us, to formal collaborations between governments and private sector companies, which may not be the same because it would not involve the same companies that, such as Microsoft perhaps. But is the role of the private sector in the creation or conception of cyber weapons changing?
There we go. A couple of things. I think the first key point here is that industry is not monolithic. When I talk about industry's participation in the development and implementation of norms and how we can have a complementary and reinforcing role in helping to reduce risk and increase predictability and stability in the ecosystem, that generally applies to a set of global industries, whether it is the global ICT industry, not just based out of the US, but based, for example, here in India, in China, all around the world. But that is a different set of equities than many in industry who are supporting and participating and contracting to governments who are carrying out offensive operations. So I think it's really important to say industry is not monolithic. There are those of us who have interest in equities in the stability of the global ecosystem from a citizenship point of view, as well as from a business point of view. And then there are those who have a very strong interest from a business point of view in enabling and continuing offensive operations. So first of all, I think that's a very important piece. In the context of collaboration between industry and government, whether it's in norms or more broadly in a wide series of cybersecurity initiatives, I think a couple of things are really important. First of all, we need to focus and ensure that the collaboration and coordination is focused on defense only, and that we're exceptionally clear that it is focused on defense only. One of the other efforts is ensuring that there's parity. In other words, Microsoft works with governments on a global basis. We work with ministries of defense. We work with intelligence agencies. But we are working in a defensive way, and we work to treat those governments with parity. And in other words, we're treating them equally. And the other piece, and this is something that is, again, very important, is being transparent in what we're working on and transparent in the benefits that are derived to the ecosystem writ large in any type of collaboration. One of the things I know that we've worked on was improving, and this was with many IT vendors, improving the security and resilience of the BIOS, the firmware that sits underneath the operating system in the environment. And we worked on that very closely with the US government. But those innovations, those features benefit the global user base. And they benefit the global user base not only for the Windows environment, but also for the broad ecosystem at large. So I think when you talk about that collaboration, it has to be structured, focused, and principled in order to ensure it does not get confused with where there is collaboration or contracting in an offensive lens.
While you have the mic, perhaps, and I'd like to ask all panelists, since we have roughly 5 minutes left, what's the one cyber norm that you would like to see pushed through in an intergovernmental platform like the UNGG?
So actually the 2015 recognized an international norm on, as I mentioned earlier, the global ICT supply chain and not subverting the broad commercial supply chain. There have been a lot of efforts driven through the G20, the G7, through bilateral arrangements that have focused on a series of the other norms. But the one that I think would hit that concern that we're worried about, the trust in ICT itself that has enabled all of these broad benefits, is that one on supply chain security. And so in terms of effectuating forward progress, I'd love to see that one promulgated and us to talk about how to focus on implementation associated with that norm.
Thanks, Angela. Chris, what is the one cyber norm that you would see?
So I'm going to fight the question. I'm not going to pick between my children. I think that I think the important part is all of them are part of a framework, and it's important to implement that entire framework together, and that makes cyberspace more stable in the long run. And understand the norms and stability framework is only one part of the answer. Hardening the target is part of the answer, strong law enforcement is part of the answer, strong cybersecurity and coordination among certs is part of the answer, diplomatic coordination is part of the answer. But that framework is important. I don't want to tear it apart, because if you just focus on one, then you lose the larger picture. But I think we have a real good set to start implementing and building on.
Santosh?
Quite agree with Chris here, completely. I think focusing on one norm would not be proper. I don't think the current set of norms, the 11 norms that were there in the 4th UNGG, can be seriously elaborated upon or expanded. I think they are in pretty good shape. The norms, in many ways, some aspects of norms are, I think, also principles of international law. So we need to also understand that as well. The other point is that, if you look at the current understanding of what is the applicability of international law, in general terms, it is much wider, but in specific terms, some of the things that was done in the 4th report tends to limit its application in certain areas in the manner in which is mentioned and needs to be advanced. Once that happens, perhaps there'd be a scope for new norms. The real progress, as some of our colleagues here mentioned, is possible in the CBMs, the confidence building measures, because those are actually about implementation, about taking action, and I think those need to be elaborated in greater detail.
So supply chain integrity, the reinforcing the applicability of international law to cyberspace. Henry?
Ron, thank you. I'm going to agree with previous speakers. I mean, the set of norms that we have are their importance is that they are a set. I would like to see General Assembly action to turn these norms into something that states agree to abide by, and that requires consensus action on a regular basis through the General Assembly. So that's what I would pitch for.
Thanks. David, is one cyber norm really too much to ask for?
Same.
Oh,
really, that's the challenge, I think. That's the biggest challenge. How do we make sure that the global community is aware, knows, and decides to abide by those norms? And probably the best way to go forward is to have the General Assembly discuss and vote a text that would gather all that has been already proposed or decided inside the GG.
Arun,
Thanks. Thanks, David.
yeah, I have a small question.
Make it very short, Jitin.
Yeah, for Chris and Angela, that Angela talked about private sector companies cooperating with different governments and intelligence agencies for active cyber defense, and you said that you treat all governments with parity, right? So last year we saw a lot of host of Facebook and Twitter accounts of ISIs being blocked because they were spreading radical propaganda. But even today we see there are a lot of terrorist organizations in our neighborhood like JET and LET who are running active, use social media and Twitter accounts, and including those of UN designated terrorists. And there has been no action on them. So do you think that if there is a request from Indian government to block the accounts of these guys, that private sector in US will be willing to cooperate? To Chris and Angela.
Chris and Angela, I'm going to ask you to have that conversation with Jitin and with Santosh, because the request should come from the Indian government. But on that note, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Angela, for joining this session. And please join me in a round of applause for this very interactive session on cyber norms.